Hello everyone, welcome back to UPSC IAS Desk Official. The second part of the series that we have started, Indian Polity by Laxmikanth. So, in part one, we have already discussed how the East India Company gradually transformed from a mere trading company into a ruler of larger part of India, and we saw important developments in form of acts like Regulating Act of 1773 and Pitt's India Act of 1784 and many charter acts, and finally the Charter Act of 1853. And by the end of 19th century, the East India Company had become the dominant political power in India. But then came an event that changed everything. I hope you understood what I'm trying to say. That even forced the British government to completely rethink how India should be governed. And that event was nothing but the revolt of 1857. Revolt of 1857, and the revolt of 1857 shook the foundation of British rule in India, and for the first time, large section of Indian soldiers, Indian rulers, and even ordinary people challenged the British authority. Although the revolt was eventually suppressed and it was not really successful, but the British government learned a very important lesson that a private company like East India Company can no longer govern a vast country like India, and as a result, new chapter in India's constitutional history began. The company rule came to an end, and the crown rule started. And from 1858 onwards, India would be governed directly by the British crown. And now, let us understand the first and most important act of this phase, that is, Government of India Act 1858. Okay, the crown takes over. Okay, so after the revolt of 1857, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act 1857, and that act, the British government decided to take direct control, and this act is called as the Act of Good Government of India. Okay, it marked the end of company rule and the beginning of direct rule by the British Crown, and it was one of the biggest turning point in Indian constitutional history. So, what did the act do? East India Company was abolished. Okay, so the East India Company lost all the governing power, and its long journey from traders to ruler came to an end. And from now on, India would be governed directly by the British Crown. Second point, India governed in the name of Queen. All powers of administration were transferred to the British Crown, and this meant India officially became part of British Empire. Right? Okay. Third point, Governor General become Viceroy. Uh, a new title was introduced. Governor General now also become the Viceroy of India. What does Viceroy means? The word Viceroy means personal representative. Personal representative. Personal representative of whom? Of British Crown in India. And the first Viceroy was Lord Canning. Right? Yeah, here. Okay. And the fourth development, double government ended. Remember, in Pitt's India Act of 1784, it had created two authorities, Board of Control and Court of Directors. Right? And this arrangement was called double government. And the Act of 1858 abolished both the bodies, and this ended the confusing dual government. And then comes the fifth important development, a Secretary of State for India created. A new office of Secretary of State for India was created, and that is powerful new office. And the Secretary of State for India became the ultimate authority for Indian affairs. He was member of British cabinet. He has full control over Indian affairs, and he was answerable to the British Parliament. Right, and this made British control much more direct. Okay, so the rule become much more stronger through this establishment. So important development 6 is Council of India created to assist Secretary of State. 15-member Council of India was established, and however this council was only advisory in nature. Okay, and the real power remained with obviously Secretary of State. And next important, body corporate status. Okay, the Secretary of State in Council became a legal entity. This meant it could sue others and be sued, both in India and England. Right? So, what did it change? Did it change anything in India? So, although the power shifted from company to the crown, the administrative system in India remained almost unchanged. So the same office continued to govern, the same bureaucracy continued to function, and only the supervision mechanism, uh, you know, has changed from India to England, from East India Company to the British Crown. Okay, so what are the important points to remember? So important points from this act is company rule ended, crown rule started, governor general become viceroy, Lord Canning was the first person to become viceroy, secretary of state for India was created, and the double government system was abolished. Right? Okay, next important act was Indian Council Act 1861, and here Indian enters the door. Okay, after 1857 the British realized they needed Indian corporation. So here, as we all know, after the revolt of 1857, the British understood an important lesson. India cannot be governed successfully without the involvement of Indians, right? And they were not ready to share powers, but they were willing to give Indians a limited role in governance. This led to the Indian Council Act of 1861. So what did that do? So first thing was Indian enters Legislative Council. Okay, so for the first time in the history, Indians were nominated to legislative councils. In 1862, Lord Canning nominated three Indians, Raja of Banaras and the Maharaja of Patiala and Sir Dinkar Rao, and this was the first formal entry of Indians into the lawmaking process. Second point, decentralization began. The Charter Act of 1833, okay, had concentrated almost all power at the center, and the British now started reversing this policy, and legislative power were restored to Bombay Presidency and Madras Presidency, and this marked the beginning of decentralization. Third important point, new provincial councils created. New legislative council were established for Bengal, 1862, and Northwestern provinces 1886, and Punjab 1897, and this expanded legislative administration across India. Fourth point, portfolio system recognized. What is portfolio system? This is actually practical administrative innovation was introduced. Each council member was assigned specific department such as you know finance, revenue, and home affairs, and this could issue order for the departments independently, and the responsible member can issue order for the department individually, and this become known as portfolio system. And if you see, it is still followed in the modern government today. Okay, and then comes the limitation. What are the shortcomings? The official majority remained. India had no real power, only voice. Indians were only nominated members. Remember this. The British officials still formed majority, and therefore Indians could express opinion, and but had very little influence over decisions. So what things to remember? First, association of Indians with lawmaking process, legislative powers restored to provinces, beginning of decentralization, and portfolio system was recognized. Okay, and then come our third important rule under the British Crown, Indian Council Act of 1892, budget discussion and indirect election. Okay, so by the late 19th century, political awareness in India was growing rapidly. Organizations like Indian National Congress was already established in 1885. They were demanding greater participation of Indians in governance. So the British responded with another limited reforms, and that in form of Indian Council Act of 1892. So what was the news, and what did that do? The number of non-official member increased. So the size of legislative council was expanded and more non-official members were added. And however, the British officials still retained control. Second development, the budget discussions were allowed. For the first time, members could discuss the annual budget, and this was important step because financial matter could now be publicly debated. Third important point, right to ask questions. Council members were allowed to ask questions to the executive, and this introduced a limited form of accountability and beginning of indirect election. This was the most significant feature. right? And certain members were nominated based on recommendation from, uh, see, this is indirect election. Indirect election. So here, certain members were nominated based on recommendations from municipalities, universities, chamber of commerce, zamindars. Okay, the act never used the word election. Officially, they were still nominated, but in practice, this was the beginning of electoral principle in India. Okay, so what was the shortcomings, the flaws? Member could only, have discussions, and they can just ask questions. Still, no real power has been given. Only discussion, no decision making. So they could not vote on the budget. They cannot control the executive, and they cannot make major decisions. So real power remained firmly with the British administration, right? Okay, now, so here, the things to remember from the Indian Council Act of 1892 was budget discussions introduced, question asking was allowed, and beginning of indirect election. Okay, so 1858, from 1858, from transfer power from the company to crown. 1861 brought Indians into council, and 1892 gave them the right to discuss and question, but not to rule. Okay, so these are the important development that you have to remember through this acts. Now let's understand the other important development. By the beginning of 20th century, the demand for political reforms in India had become stronger. The British government could see that educated Indians wanted a greater role in governance. So to respond to this demand, the British introduced the Indian Council Act of 1909. It is popularly known as Morley-Minto Reform or Minto-Morley Reform, whatever you can call it as. But it has been very well known by the communal electorates. Okay, that communal electorates has begun by this act. So this was big turning point, but for the wrong reasons. John Morley was the secretary of state for India, and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India at that time in 1909. The act expanded participation in government but also planted the seed of future division. So, what did the act do? What are the provisions it had? Legislative Council expanded. The size of Legislative Council was increased significantly. Member rose from 16 to 60, and this allowed more Indians to participate in discussion. Second point, non-official majority in provinces. For the first time, provincial council could have a majority of non-official members. This appeared to be a step towards greater representation. However, the executive still remain under British control. Okay. So third important point, more legislative power. Member could now ask supplementary questions, and they can move resolution on budget. This increased the discussion and criticism of government policies. Fourth important development, first Indian in Viceroy's Executive Council. So historic milestone was achieved. For the first time, an Indian become a member of Viceroy's Executive Council. That person was Satyendra Prasad Sinha. He served as the law member, and this was symbolically important because Indians had finally entered the highest executive body. Okay, and another important point here, separate electorates introduced for Muslims. This was most important and controversial provision. Under the system of separate electorate, Muslim voters could vote only for Muslim candidates, and Muslim representatives were elected only by Muslim voters. And this was the first time religion became the basis for or basis of political representation, right? And another important point, special representation for certain groups. Separate representation was also provided for, you know, chamber of commerce, presidency corporation, universities, and zamindars. And this meant representation was based on special interest rather than equal citizenship. There was no equal citizenship. right? Okay. So what was the flaws? Why was this act criticized? It legalized communal politics, first of all, right? Okay. The British followed a policy often, we all describe as divide and rule, right? So, by creating separate electorates, the act encouraged people to think politically in terms of religious identity rather than national identity. So, many Indian leaders believe this would weaken our national unity. So, next important point, the father of communal electorates, because he introduced this system, Lord Minto, he came to be known as father of communal electorates in India. Third important flaw was real power still remained with the British. So even after this reform, official majority remained at the center. Executive remained independent of the legislature, right? And council could discuss but not control the government. Right, the executive was still not responsible to the legislature, and still the council could just discuss but cannot control and influence any government decision. Okay, so what are the important point here? First Indian joint Viceroy's Executive Council, that is Satyendra Prasad Sinha. Separate electorates introduced for Muslims, and Legislative Council has been expanded. Supplementary questions and resolutions were allowed, but executives still not responsible to the legislature. Right? Okay. Now another important act. The Government of India Act 1919 calls Montego Chelmsford Reforms, also called the Diarchy Experiment. In 1917, the British government made an important announcement, and for the first time, it declared that India would gradually move towards responsible government. Okay, and this act came in 1919 and took effect in 1921. So, this declaration came from Edwin Montego and Lord Chelmsford. So their recommendation resulted in the Government of India Act 1919. So this act introduced a complete new experiment called diarchy. So the word diarchy means rule by two authorities. Rule by two authorities. Right? Okay. So think of a province being run by two different government at the same time. Some subjects were given to Indian ministers, and other important subjects remain under British control, and this system was introduced at the provincial level. Okay, provincial level. What did the act do? So, first of all, separation of central and provincial subject. Central government, okay, for the first time, subjects were divided between central government and provincial government. And this is, this was an early step towards federal governance. Okay, but the structure remained unitary. However, India still remained a unitary state because the center retained dominance. And second point, diarchy was introduced in just provinces. Provincial subjects were divided into two categories, that is transfer subjects and reserve subjects. Transfer subjects, education, health, agriculture, local self-government, administered by governor plus minister responsible to the legislature, and reserve subject were like law, finance, police and revenue, administered by the governor plus executive council, not responsible to the legislature. Okay, so the first one, these are handled by governor and ministers, and these ministers were responsible to the legislature. And second category, reserve subjects, were remain under governor and executive council, and they were not responsible to the legislature. So simple example, suppose there is an Indian minister and wanted to improve schools. So education is under transfer subject. You can see that here, right? And you know, if you want to improve schools or you want to do something, but the money was under money come from finance, and which was under reserve subject. So the governor controlled finance. So the minister often could not, implement any plan according to his wish, because uh, they can make plans, and they if they want to do something, but the finance is under reserve subjects. So this become one of the biggest weaknesses of diarchy. Okay, still they don't have much power. It has just been given on papers. So next important point, bicameralism. Bicameral legislature introduced at the center. For the first time, central legislature become bicameral. Okay. The council of state, that is upper house, and legislative assembly, that is lower house, and most members were directly elected, and this was major constitutional development that happened through this act. So fourth important development, more Indians in executive council. So 3 out of 6 members of the viceroy's executive council had to be Indian. Okay, this increased the Indian participation in administration. And next important point, separate electorates expanded. Again, the communal system introduced in 1909 was extended to 6 Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. And instead of reducing communal division, the act widened it further. And the next important point, limited franchise. Voting rights were not universal. It was based on property ownership, tax payments, and educational qualification. So as a result, only small percentage of Indians could participate in elections. And important development, the High Commissioner for India created a new office called the High Commissioner for India, was established in London, and some responsibilities of the Secretary of State was transferred to this office. And Public Service Commission, set up in 1926, and it later evolved into today's Union Public Service Commission, UPSC. Okay. And next point, separate provincial budget. Provincial government were now allowed to prepare and pass their own budget. This increased financial decentralization. And next point, statutory commission provisions. The act provided that after every 10 years, a commission would review its working, and this eventually led to the appointment of Simon Commission. Now let's understand the failure of diarchy. Why did diarchy fail? The transfer of subject depends on fund controlled by reserve subjects. So minister had responsibility but lacked resources. So money, they had no money and they had no real power. So because of that, because of lack of resources, they cannot actually execute any of their plans. Next point, governor had overriding power. The governor could overrule ministers whenever he wanted, and thus real authority remain with British officials. So the authority has been, as I said, given on papers, but in real terms, the whole authority remained with British officials. So limited voting right, as I said, most Indians were excluded from election, and political participation, was too limited. And the number of, no diarchy at the center. The center government remained firmly under British control. So responsible government was introduced only partially and only in provinces. So no diarchy at the center, still unitary and full authority of the center. Center dominant was still, uh, it was still continue. So what are the major, development that you have to remember from the exam point of view? Government of India Act 1990, known as Montego Chelmsford Reforms, the diarchy introduced in the provinces, bicameral legislature introduced, public service commission established, and separate electorates for, that division has been further expanded. So 1909, divided representation on religious line through separate electorates has been started, while 1919 experimented with the limited self-government through diarchy, but real power still remained with the British people. Right? Okay. So as I said, in Government of India Act 1919, there was a provision that statutory commission has been established, and they said that after every 10 years a commission would appointed, and that would review the working of these acts, and eventually that led to the appointment of Simon Commission. And Simon Commission has been appointed in 1927, and it has been appointed 2 years earlier. And all the seven members of Simon Commission were British, so all parties boycotted it. And Simon Commission had submitted its report in 1930. So I hope you heard in history that Simon Go Back slogans has been raised, after their arrival. So we'll see that, those all important events in history. While we are going to cover that, we'll definitely go through those important events as well. So here, these are all seven members of Simon Commission, and so all parties has boycotted this commission. They have submitted the reports in 1913, and they have given recommendation as abolition of diarchy and responsible government in provinces, and the Federation of British India plus princely state, should come together and form a federation, and continuation of communal electorates. So roundtable conference has been held, plus white paper has been, that is an act has been made, and that led to the Government of India Act 1935. And before that, Communal Award 1932 has been announced by Ramsay MacDonald, British Prime Minister, that extended separate electorates to depressed classes, scheduled caste too. And then for that, Gandhiji has been really disappointed, and he went on a fast. And after that, they have come to a conclusion in form of Pune Pact 1932. After the negotiation, the Pune Pact was signed between Gandhiji and Dr. B. R. Ambedkar, and you know joint electorates for Hindus. Hindus has been announced with the reserved seats for depressed classes, because they were trying to separate depressed class from Hindu community. So that is why, that is the thing that has made Gandhiji really upset. So after that, Pune Pact has been signed 1932, and after that, round table conference has been held, and white paper has been published, that is in form of act, and that led to the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, let's understand what is it. So by the 1930s, it had become really clear that diarchy introduced in 1919 had failed. First point. And Indian leaders demanded greater self-government, and the British government held 3 roundtable conferences and studied the recommendation of Simon Commission. These recommendations, and based on this discussion, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act 1935, and this was the longest and the most detailed act, a major milestone. Okay, and if you see, most constitutional laws ever enacted for India. So that is the Government of India Act 1935. It contains 321 section and 10 schedules. So many features of today's constitution can be traced back from this act of 1935. So what did the act propose? So the act proposed All India Federation. The act proposed All India Federation consists of British India plus princely state as one unit, and the idea was to unite the whole country under one federal structure. This federation never come to existence because princely state refused to join the federation. Second, 3 legislative list. For the first time, powers were divided through 3 lists: federal list with 59 items for center, provincial list with 54 items for provinces, and concurrent list for both, right, with 36 items. Here a subject shared by both the parties, federal government and provincial government, and residuary power went to the viceroy, to the center. So here, this become the foundation of the present day union, state and concurrent list in Indian constitution. Third important point, provincial autonomy. This was one of the most important reform, because the hierarchy system in the provinces was abolished, and the provincial governments were now given autonomy, and ministers become responsible to the provincial legislature, and the governor was expected to act on ministerial advices. And the system came into force in 1937 and stopped in 1939. Why? We are going to see that. And then fourth important development was diarchy at the center. Ironically, while diarchy was abolished in the provinces, but it was proposed for the center, and however, this provision was never implemented. Then bicameralism in 6 provinces: Bengal Presidency, Bombay, Madras, Bihar, Assam, UP had legislative councils, upper house, and legislative assembly, lower house. Right, and the separate electorates expanded. The communal electorate system was extended further, and separate representation was divided to depressed classes, women, and laborers. This deepened the political division even more. And next important point, Council of India was abolished. Council of India from 1858 was abolished, and the Secretary of State was now, assisted by advisory instead. The Secretary of State had advisories now. Okay, so the Council of 15 members has been abolished, and the franchise expanded. Voting rights were increased. 10% of Indian population become eligible to vote. Although it was limited, but it was significant increase from whatever earlier arrangement we have seen. It was still the best arrangements. And important developments: Reserve Bank of India was established in 1935, and which began functioning in 1935. Public Service Commission, the Act established Federal Public Service Commission and Provincial Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission. And this later inspired today's UPSC and state PCs and state PSCs. Okay. Now, federal courts. Federal court established in 1937. It became the predecessors of today's Supreme Court in India, right? And what are the limitations? Why did the act fail? Federation never materialized. Federation never worked. Princely state refused to join. Therefore, the federal scheme remained only on papers. Diarchy at the center never started. Once one of the major provisions was never implemented, and the governor retained special powers. Governor could still override elected ministers' decision or opinion in any situation. Thus, complete responsible government did not come into existence. Communal divisions increased, separate electorates continued and expanded. The further division, this has been marked the further division in Indian society. British control still remain in important areas such as defense and foreign affairs. Still, these areas had British authority, and they had veto power as well. Okay, so they can make a veto on any minister's opinion, or any of their combined union, the elected minister's opinion, they can veto at any time. So important takeaway: provincial autonomy introduced during the Act of 1935, and 3 legislative lists introduced, federal court established, RBI established, and basis for federalism and public service commission. Right? Then important act, the Indian Independence Act of 1947, the final act. After decades of struggle, sacrifices, movements, negotiations, the British rule in India was coming to an end. On 20th February 1947, PM Clement Attlee announced that British rule would end no later than June 1948. However, events moved much faster, and the date was advanced to 15th August 1947, and the British Parliament then passed the Indian Independence Act 1947. And this became the final constitutional law of British India. Why? What did the act do? What are the key provisions? Creation of two dominions. So the British India was divided into India and Pakistan. Both become independent dominions. Second, freedom for princely state. Princely states were free to join either India, Pakistan, or they can remain independent. This created one of the biggest political challenge after independence for India. And the government until new constitution were framed, both dominions would continue to be governed under the Government of India Act 1935 with necessary modification, right? And the Governor General become constitutional head. The Governor General now had to act on the advice of ministers. The old autocratic powers disappeared. No more autocratic. End of royal veto. The British monarch uh, could no longer veto laws passed in India, so legislative sovereignty shifted to Indian authorities from British Crown. Emperor of Indian title abolished. The British king dropped the title Emperor of India, and this symbolized the end of imperial rule. Next important point, the Secretary of State for India abolished. The powerful office created in 1858 was abolished, and its function were transferred to the Secretary for Commonwealth Affairs. Okay, Commonwealth Affairs. And civil services continued, and existing civil servants retained their rights, salaries, and benefits, and this ensured administrative continuity. The historic midnight came at last after such struggle, such sacrifice. At midnight between 14th and 15th August 1947, British rule officially ended, and India and Pakistan became two independent dominions. The first Governor General of independent India was Lord Mountbatten, and the first Minister was Jawaharlal Nehru. Right? And yes, the Constituent Assembly now function as India's sovereign legislature and begin the final task of framing the constitution. Okay, so now what we have seen from 1773 to 1947, every act tried to either centralize or decentralize power and associate Indians or protect British interests. So 1973 we have seen, regulating act laid the foundation of the British rule, and 1833 extreme centralizations we have seen, and 1858 the crown takeover. 1861 act started Indian is it's opened the door for Indians to um, to take part in the legislative process. And 1909 the act introduced communal divide. 1919 the act introduced diarchy and bicameralism. In 1935 1935 Act, the provincial autonomy and federal structure has been introduced, that we have seen. In 1947 an Act, freedom and participation. The India finally got freedom, and the partition we have seen from India and Pakistan. So from 1773 to 1947, every constitutional act either strengthened the British control, or involve Indians in governance, or it prepared the ground for self government. So together this development ultimately culminated in the Indian Constitution, or the Constitution of India, which came into force on 26 January 1915. So that's it for today. I hope you understood. If you have any doubt, please let me know in the comment section. If you have any topic that you want me to make videos on, please let me know in the comment section. Thank you so much.